The accounts you are about to read are based on true events, personal experiences, and oral traditions that have been passed down through generations. These stories reflect the profound and often unnerving interactions humans have had with the mysterious beings known as Jinn. Each tale is rich with detail, exploring the depths of the unseen world and the powerful faith required to navigate these encounters. The Cursed Wedding. In the heart of a small Egyptian village, preparations for the wedding of Hanan and Khaled had been underway for months. The entire community was invited, and the festivities promised to be the most magnificent event the village had seen in years. As the bride walked down the aisle in her intricately embroidered gown, a hush fell over the crowd. It was then that an elderly woman dressed in rags made her appearance. She was well known in the village, a widow who lived on the outskirts, speaking to no one except in cryptic mutterings. As she approached the gathering, a few children whispered, "It's the Mad Widow." But before she could reach the couple, the bride's father intercepted her and harshly demanded she leave. The woman, her face shadowed by the low sun, murmured something indecipherable, then fixed her gaze on the bride. Her words rang clear. "You'll regret this by dawn." The festivities continued, but an unease lingered in the air. That night, the couple retired to their new home. Khaled, exhausted, fell asleep quickly. Hanan, still buzzing with nervous energy, sat brushing her hair in front of the mirror. Suddenly, her reflection changed. Instead of her own, she saw a face with hollow eyes and a wide, unnatural grin staring back at her. Her scream shattered the silence, waking Khaled. By the time he reached her, she was unconscious on the floor. The next morning, Hanan remained unresponsive, her body cold to the touch but still breathing. The village imam was summoned, and he immediately identified signs of a spiritual affliction. As he recited Quranic verses, her body began convulsing. A guttural voice, not her own, erupted from her mouth. She was warned. The family realized the elderly woman had invoked a jinn to curse their celebration. They sought her out, offering apologies and gifts. She relented, muttering a prayer as the imam continued his ruqya. By evening, Hanan woke, though her face bore an unshakable expression of fear whenever she glanced at the mirror. From that day, no celebration in the village began without a prayer of protection, and no visitor, no matter how strange, was turned away. The guardian of the mountain, Omar, an experienced mountaineer, often laughed at the warnings locals gave him about jinn-haunted peaks. To him, they were just myths meant to keep people away from dangerous terrain. One summer, he planned an ambitious solo trek through a remote range in Afghanistan, dismissing the villagers' caution about a particular cave he would pass. After a day's climb, Omar set up camp near the cave, its dark maw gaping like an unspoken warning. As night fell, the air grew unusually cold, and an eerie stillness enveloped the area. He cooked a small meal, lay in his tent, and drifted off to sleep. In the middle of the night, a sound woke him, footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. Gripping his flashlight, he unzipped the tent and scanned the darkness. The beam illuminated nothing but the rocky landscape. He was about to return inside when a whisper carried through the air, distinct yet impossible to place. "You shouldn't be here." His heart pounding, Omar stumbled back into the tent and recited Ayat al-Kursi from memory. The whispers stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. When morning came, he found strange symbols etched into the dirt around his tent, symbols that looked neither natural nor man-made. Despite his fear, Omar pressed on with his journey. But as he climbed higher, the air grew heavier, and the sensation of being watched became unbearable. At one point, he felt an unseen force pushing against his chest, as though trying to drive him back down the mountain. Terrified, Omar descended as quickly as he could. When he reached the village, an elder explained that the cave was the domain of a Jinn tribe who despised intruders. The elder advised him to seek forgiveness through prayer and charity. Omar never returned to that range, carrying the lesson that some places are not meant to be explored. The Possessed Factory Worker. In Istanbul, a sprawling factory employed hundreds of workers. It operated around the clock, and those on the night shift often whispered about eerie happenings, lights flickering without cause, tools disappearing, and disembodied laughter echoing in the halls. Most chalked it up to tired minds playing tricks, but everything changed when Yusuf, a young technician, became the target of a Jinn's wrath. It began with small incidents. Tools Yusuf was certain he'd left in one place would reappear in another, and machines would malfunction inexplicably when he was nearby. One night, as he worked alone, he felt a cold hand brush against his neck. Spinning around, he saw nothing but shadows. The situation escalated a week later. While operating a large machine, Yusuf suddenly collapsed, convulsing violently. His coworkers rushed to help, but as they approached, he sat up with a chilling smile. His voice, deeper and more menacing than usual, boomed, "This place is ours." The workers froze in terror. The factory manager immediately called an imam, who arrived with a Quran and began reciting Ruqya. Yusuf writhed and screamed as the Jinn revealed itself, claiming the factory had been built on land it considered sacred. The imam, undeterred, continued his recitation until Yusuf fell unconscious. When he awoke, Yusuf had no memory of what had happened. The imam advised the factory owners to purify the premises by reciting Surah al-Baqarah and maintaining cleanliness. The strange occurrences ceased, but Yusuf left the job, unwilling to face the place where he had been possessed. The bride of the Jinn, in the mountainous regions of Oman, folklore warns of Jinn who fall in love with humans. One such tale is that of Layla, a young woman known for her beauty. On the night of her wedding, she disappeared without a trace. Her family and the groom's relatives searched tirelessly, but days turned into weeks with no sign of her. Months later, a shepherd claimed to have seen her in the mountains, her figure ethereal and her eyes empty. When he called out to her, she turned and vanished into the mist. The village elders speculated that a Jinn had fallen in love with Layla and taken her to its realm. Though the family performed prayers and offered sadaqah to seek her return, she was never seen again. To this day, her story is a warning to young women to avoid wandering alone in the mountains. The haunted village of Wadi al-Rumayla. A group of travelers once ventured into the remote village of Wadi al-Rumayla in Saudi Arabia. They had heard the old stories of the village being cursed and avoided by the locals. One evening, the group decided to camp outside the village, seeking shelter near an abandoned home. As night fell, strange sounds echoed from within the house. Footsteps, whispers, and the rattling of chains. One of the travelers, a man named Ahmed, ventured inside to investigate. He felt an immediate coldness in the air and heard what seemed like muffled voices chanting in a language he couldn't understand. As he moved deeper into the home, a black, formless shadow appeared in the corner of the room. It was a figure that seemed to flicker and move with the shadows, as if made of smoke and fire, though it had no face. His heart raced, and he quickly fled the house, but not before hearing the unmistakable sound of a voice whispering his name, urging him to stay. The group left Wadi al-Rumayla early the next morning, and the travelers never spoke of the incident again. Locals claim that the Jinn in the area are particularly hostile and have long been known to trick, deceive, and even harm those who dare trespass into their territory. The Jinn encounter in the desert. A Bedouin man named Faisal was traveling across the desert with a caravan. One evening, as they camped in a vast, empty stretch of sand, Faisal wandered away from the campfire to take a closer look at the dunes. As he walked further, he noticed something strange. His footsteps were no longer leaving marks in the sand, even though the ground was soft and loose. He felt an unease creeping up his spine as the air around him grew colder. Suddenly he saw a figure, tall and black, with no distinct features, just a flickering silhouette like smoke. It hovered just above the ground, moving towards him with unnatural speed. Faisal could feel an oppressive presence, and he instinctively turned to flee, but the figure seemed to follow him. His heart raced, and he stumbled in the sand. But when he finally looked back, the figure was gone. The next morning, Faisal confided in his fellow travelers. One of the older men, who had heard of such encounters before, explained that the desert was a known dwelling for Jinn, particularly those who wandered aimlessly or lured travelers to their doom. Faisal never ventured too far into the desert alone again. The woman and the Jinn in the empty house. A woman named Layla lived in a remote village in the mountains of Yemen. She had heard stories from her grandmother about the Jinn who haunted the old abandoned houses in the area. However, Layla was skeptical until the day she moved into one such house. Soon after settling in, she began hearing strange noises at night, scratching, tapping, and the faint sound of whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind or the house settling, but one evening, as she sat alone in the dark, she felt a sudden chill in the air. A shadow passed by the window, and the hairs on her neck stood on end. When she looked outside, no one was there. The next night, Layla decided to confront the source of the disturbances. She lit a candle and sat in the center of the room waiting. As the minutes passed, the temperature in the room dropped, and a cold breeze swept through the house. Suddenly, a dark, faceless figure appeared at the far end of the room, its body flickering like smoke. Layla could barely breathe, paralyzed by fear. The figure slowly advanced towards her, but just as it reached out, the candle flickered and extinguished. Layla rushed out of the house and never returned, leaving the village shortly afterward. Villagers later told her that the house was haunted by a powerful Jinn who had been terrorizing residents for decades. It was said that the Jinn took the form of a black, formless entity, and that anyone who dared enter would be cursed. The encounter with the Jinn in the old cemetery. A young man named Rashid was visiting his family in a small town in Morocco. He had heard of an old cemetery on the outskirts of the town, said to be the final resting place of ancient figures and powerful beings. Rashid, curious and intrigued by the tales, decided to visit the cemetery alone one evening. As he walked among the tombstones, a heavy fog began to roll in, obscuring the path before him. After a few minutes, he began to feel a strange presence, as if he was being watched. Suddenly, the air grew cold and the sound of footsteps echoed through the mist, though no one was visible. Rashid turned around and saw a dark figure standing near a tombstone. It was a tall, shadowy silhouette with no discernible face or features, just a smoky, flickering form that seemed to melt into the fog. Rashid froze in place, his heart pounding. The figure moved closer, its presence oppressive and suffocating. As it reached out toward him, a loud, echoing whisper filled the air. Rashid couldn't understand the words, but it felt like a warning. In an instant, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the thick, unnatural fog. Rashid fled the cemetery and returned home, shaken and terrified. The next day, he spoke to the elders in the village, who explained that the cemetery was known to be haunted by a Jinn who had been bound to the area for centuries. Locals avoided the place, believing it to be cursed and dangerous for anyone who dared enter.